The river air was damp with the smell of pine and rain when Robb Stark first heard the name Oberyn Martell whispered among the Frey's campfires. It came from a half-drunk Sellsword, muttering about a prince in the far south who hated the Lannisters, even more than the young wolf did. Robb ignored it at first. His war council had no room for drunken tavern tales, but the name kept coming up. Oberyn of Dawn, the Red Viper, a man who fought like wildfire and smiled while doing it. A man who, by all accounts, had waited decades for a chance to draw Lannister blood. By the time a rider came from Riverrun bearing a sealed letter marked, "With the Sun and Spear," Robb was curious enough to break it open himself. The message was short. "We share an enemy. We share a cause. I will meet you where the waters meet the road. Bring only those you trust with your life." Catelyn read it twice over his shoulder, her lips pressed thin. "This is dangerous," she said. "The Martells are patient, but they are not friends to the north." "They're not friends to the Lannisters either," Robb replied. "And that's enough for me right now." 2 weeks later, he rode with only Grey Wind, Seer Brynden Blackfish, and Lord Bolton, who had asked too eagerly to come, toward a lonely stone bridge on the edge of the Riverlands. The morning fog clung to the river like a ghost, and for a moment Robb thought the Dornish prince might not come. Then he saw him, tall, lean, dressed in gold-trimmed leather, a spear in one hand and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Oberyn Martell greeted him like an old friend. "King in the north," he said with a slight bow. "You have your father's eyes, and his enemies." Robb nodded. "I hear you share those enemies." "I do," Oberyn said. "The Lannisters murdered my sister and her children. Well, they murdered your father and stole your crown before it was even warm. Between us, I believe we could make them bleed from two ends of the realm." They spoke for hours under the shade of an ash tree. Oberyn promised what Dorne had always withheld from the other kingdoms: fast-moving cavalry that could harry the Lannisters' supply lines, spies in King's Landing, and most tempting, the possibility of a marriage alliance to unite the North and Dorne for generations. "I have a niece," Oberyn said with a sly grin. "She is fierce, proud, and entirely uninterested in doing what she's told." You would like her. Robb thought of Talisa, the woman he'd already given his heart to, but said nothing. By the time the sun dipped low, the Red Viper had convinced him. The alliance would be secret for now. Oberyn would return to Sunspear to rally forces, while Robb would keep the Riverlands aflame with war to hold Tywin's attention. In 6 months, they would meet again to march together. As they parted, Oberyn's last words stayed with him. "Strike with honor if you must, King in the North. But when the moment comes to kill a Lannister, do not stop to pray." That night, Robb dreamed of fire and gold, fire burning Lannister banners, gold spilling from broken coffers, and somewhere in the midst of it all, the Red Viper's grin. The war council at Riverrun buzzed with rumors, though none dared to speak the truth aloud. Robb had returned from his mysterious ride with no explanation, no public treaty, and a face that looked older than his years. Even Catelyn couldn't pry the details from him, though she guessed enough to know something dangerous had been set in motion. Officially, Robb's plan was the same as before: harry the Lannister forces, bleed them in skirmishes, and hold the Riverlands until Tywin made a mistake. But beneath the official orders ran a current of quiet preparation. Scouts sent far, south under false banners, supply caches hidden in abandoned villages, and letters smuggled through merchants bound for the Dornish marches. Oberyn's part in the scheme began almost immediately. In King's Landing, whispers of unrest in the southern deserts reached Tywin's ears. Reports spoke of Dornish lords quietly mustering men, of Prince Doran taking an unusual interest in court politics. Tywin dismissed it as posturing. Dorne had stayed out of Robert's rebellion until the last possible moment, and he believed they would do so again. That was exactly what Oberyn wanted him to believe. Meanwhile, Robb struck at the Lannisters with sudden ferocity. Small bands of Stark riders raided supply lines, burning stores and capturing prisoners for exchange. Bolton, ever watchful, offered clever and unsettlingly brutal ways to sow fear among the enemy. The young wolf didn't always approve, but he tolerated it for now. War had a way of twisting what honor meant. One night, as Robb and the Blackfish reviewed a map by firelight, a rider slipped into camp. The man bore the Martell Sonan spear on his cloak, though he kept it hidden until he was inside the king's tent. His message was simple: the Viper moves. The sands are restless. Robb felt a surge of cautious hope. Oberyn's forces were not the massed ranks of knights and pikemen the north fielded. They were fast, unpredictable, deadly in ambush. They began to hit Lannister patrols in the southern reach, forcing Tywin to split his attention. Every soldier sent south was one less to guard the Riverlands, and Robb pressed the advantage, taking small victories that built into something greater. But secrecy weighed heavy. Robb couldn't tell Edmure Tully the truth, nor his bannermen, many of whom viewed Dorne with distrust. Even Grey Wind seemed restless, pacing at night as if sensing the shifting winds of war. Then came the first sign that the alliance might cost more than Robb expected. Bolton approached him after a late-night council, his pale eyes glinting in the torchlight. "You make new friends in strange places, Your Grace," he said, softly, careful. "A viper is loyal to nothing but its own venom." Robb stared at him, wondering just how much the man had guessed and what he might do with that knowledge. Far to the south, Oberyn received his own warning. A letter from Sunspear carried Doran's careful hand. "Your cause is not Doran's cause. Do not drag our house into the Wolf's War unless you can guarantee the Lion's death." Oberyn smiled as he burned the parchment. Guarantees were for cautious men. The North and Dorne were moving toward each other like two storms set to meet, and the Lannisters didn't yet know they stood in the path of both. Tywin Lannister was a man who believed in two things above all else: that gold bought loyalty, and that patience won wars. But as autumn crept over the Riverlands, he began to suspect the rules had shifted. Reports from the south grew stranger with each raven. Patrols vanished without a trace in the Dornish marches. Supply trains bound. For the Reach were found abandoned, their guards' throats slit cleanly in the night. Merchants whispered of Dornish riders passing through border towns in twos and threes, never staying long enough to be cornered and in the Riverlands. The young wolf had stopped retreating, instead of skirmishing and vanishing into the woods. Robb was striking hard, taking keeps, burning storehouses, and holding ground. Edmure's forces along the Red Fork harassed Lannister movements so effectively that Jaime himself would have been needed to break them, had he not still been Tywin's prisoner. By the third week of this new pressure, Tywin ordered a council. In Harrenhal, Kevan argued for pulling back forces from the Reach to reinforce the Riverlands. Seer Adam Marbrand suggested cutting deeper into the north before winter made roads impassable. But Grand Maester Pycelle, blinking like an old owl, voiced the fear none wished to name. "My lord, the Dornish do not march without cause." Tywin's gaze was as sharp as a drawn blade. You think they've allied with Stark. I think Pycelle hesitated. I think Prince Oberyn Martell has long memories, and Stark's war gives him opportunity. If Oberyn's name had been poison, Tywin's face would not have changed, but his fingers drummed once, slow and deliberate, on the table. Far from Harrenhal, Oberyn was already laying the next trap. He had taken a small force of mounted spearmen, northward, slipping through the Stormlands under false banners. They struck at a Lannister-held village in the Reach with surgical precision, killing every officer and leaving the common folk untouched. The message was unmistakable. The Red Viper had sunk his fangs into the lion's paw back in the Riverlands. A cloaked figure entered Robb's war tent at midnight. No guards stopped him, for he'd come from within the camp. Roose Bolton, there. Starting to suspect, Your Grace, Bolton said without preamble. I can see it in the Lannister movements. They'll try to cut the road between you and whatever southern help you've acquired. Robb didn't flinch. Then we move faster. You move faster, Bolton said, voice low, and you. Leave enemies in your wake who will gut you the moment your new friend tires of this war. Robb dismissed him with a sharp look, but Bolton's words lingered. Trusting Oberyn was a gamble, one he was willing to make for the chance to break Tywin before winter. 2 weeks later, the gamble drew its first real blood. A joint operation, small but decisive. Stark riders and Dornish spearmen converged on a Lannister supply column in the Riverlands, destroying it entirely. Not one man survived to carry word back. For the first time, Robb and Oberyn stood on the same field, their cloaks whipping in the wind, the air thick with the copper scent of blood. Oberyn looked at the carnage and smiled without a trace of pity. The prince said, "Is how wars are won, not with banners and songs, with hunger and fear." Robb said nothing, but in his heart he wondered if he'd just crossed the point where honor could no longer follow. Snow was already dusting the northern Riverlands when Tywin Lannister set his counterstroke into motion. He knew the Stark boy was moving with unusual confidence, and the Dornish attacks in the south were no coincidence. If Oberyn Martell had truly thrown in with the wolf, then the war was no longer a matter of patience. It was a race. His orders went out under the seal of secrecy. Goldcloaks in King's Landing began rounding up every Dornish merchant, sellsword, and envoy they could find, questioning them with methods that left few able to speak again. Ravens were sent to House Tyrell, reminding them that the Dornish were their ancestral rivals and suggesting certain rewards if they would seal off the Reach against further southern interference. And in the Riverlands, Tywin recalled several veteran companies from the west to create a roving strike force whose only task was to intercept and destroy whatever southern troops had slipped north. Robb could feel the tightening noose. Raids were getting harder, enemy patrols were growing larger and bolder, and the Lannisters' supply lines weren't as vulnerable as they had been just weeks before. The young Wolf's War Council debated for hours, and still there was no clear answer. Then a raven came, no seal, just a strip of parchment in a cipher only Robb and Oberyn had agreed upon. The message read, "The Reach grows cold. Your foe courts them with honey. Meet me at Stonehenge in 7 days." Robb left at dawn with a small escort, Catelyn's protests ringing in his ears. Grey wind padded beside his horse, a silent shadow. The road to Stonehenge was treacherous. Twice they spotted Lannister outriders in the distance, but by nightfall of the 7th day, the flicker of torches revealed Oberyn Martell's camp. The prince looked more dangerous than ever, thinner, sharper, like a blade that had been honed since their first meeting, over a map lit by firelight. He pointed to the reach. "They mean to close the door here," Oberyn said. "If they succeed, Dawn's riders will have to turn back or be trapped." "Then we break it before it closes," Robb replied. Oberyn's smile was quick and full of mischief. "I have a plan for that, but it will not be clean." The plan turned out to be a lightning strike into the Reach, not to seize land, but to burn 3 key supply depots that fed Lannister armies on both fronts. Oberyn's riders would move in small bands, hitting the targets within the same night, while Stark forces staged a diversion in the Riverlands to draw Tywin's attention northward. Robb agreed, though the risk was enormous. If either force was caught, they would be isolated and outnumbered. The operation began under a new moon. Robb's diversion worked almost too well. Tywin's roving companies clashed with Stark scouts near Riverrun, and the fighting grew so fierce that Bolton himself led a sortie to keep the enemy engaged. Meanwhile, far to the south, riders struck like desert vipers, killing guards, torching supplies, and vanishing before the smoke even reached the stars. By the time Tywin realized what had happened, the damage was done. His armies in the Riverlands were suddenly short of food, and his southern flank was bleeding resources to protect against further Dornish incursions. For the first time since the war began, Robb saw something new in the reports from Harrenhal: uncertainty. But Tywin Lannister was not beaten yet. The next Raven to reach the Stark camp would carry news meant to drive a wedge straight through the Wolf and the Viper. The Raven came at dawn, its wings black against the pale winter sky. Robb broke the seal himself, expecting another report from a Riverland scout, but the parchment inside made his stomach twist. It was a single line, written in a bold, deliberate hand. "The Red Viper feasts, while your bannermen starve." Attached was a smaller note, in Tywin's unmistakable script, listing names: Lord Karstark, Lord Glover, and several Riverlands lords, along with claims that Dornish riders had raided their villages, burned their fields, and taken their grain south. Catelyn read over his shoulder, her voice low and urgent. "You know this is meant to divide you." "I know," Robb said. "But the names, they were real villagers, real bannermen, and the reports from the past week had indeed mentioned southern raiders spotted far from the front. Could Oberyn's men have gone rogue? Or was this Tywin's trap tightening? When Oberyn arrived 3 days later, Robb wasted no time. The meeting was held in Robb's war tent, the air heavy with unspoken accusations. Grey wind paced between them, hackles rising. "You've been striking villages far from the front," Robb said flatly. Oberyn's dark eyes narrowed. "If my men did, it was to feed themselves on the march. This is war, Stark. You think your Northmen don't take what they need when they cross enemy lands?" "They are Lannister lands when we do it," Robb said, voice sharp. "Tywin claims you've been hitting my bannermen's villagers." Oberyn laughed once, without humor. "And you believe him?" Silence stretched between them. Outside, the muffled sounds of the camp went on, horses stamping, men sharpening blades. But inside, the air was tense enough to snap. Bolton, standing in the shadows, spoke for the first time. "It would be dangerous, Your Grace, too. Let suspicion fester. A snake will coil tighter if it fills the boot." Robb ignored him. "I need to know the truth." Oberyn stepped closer until the firelight caught the glint of his teeth. "The truth is this, Stark. If I wished to turn on you, you would already be dead. I am not your enemy. But if your lords cannot stomach a little blood in their fields, perhaps they are not ready for the war they begged you to lead." The words stung, but Robb let them pass. He knew Tywin's hand was in this, yet the seed of doubt had been planted, and Oberyn knew it too. That night, Robb dreamed of a battlefield split in two, wolves on one side, vipers on the other, both facing the lion, but their backs turned to each other. Far away, in Harrenhal, Tywin read the latest reports with cold satisfaction. His letters had reached more than just Robb Stark. Several of the northern bannermen were now sending ravens of their own, questioning their king's southern friends. The wedge was in place. All Tywin needed was the right blow to split it apart, and he already knew what it would be. The blow came not with a battle, but with a feast. Ravens flew ahead of the news, carrying whispers of slaughter in the Stormlands. The target was a small but strategically placed settlement, Stondor, held by a minor house, sworn to House Baratheon, but sympathetic to the North's cause. By the time word reached Robb's camp, the details were grim. The garrison butchered, the storehouses burned, the survivors swearing that the attackers were mounted Dornish spearmen, flying no banners. The timing was too perfect. Tywin had struck exactly where suspicion between wolf and viper was ripest. By sunset, Robb's war council was in uproar. Lord Karstark slammed a mailed fist on the map table. "This is what comes of letting southern vipers into our war. They've turned on us already." Edmure Tully tried to defend the alliance, pointing out that no proof tied the raid to Oberyn's main host, but the murmurs around the tent were against him. Bolton, quiet until now, spoke in a voice that carried like cold steel, "Your Grace, the perception alone will bleed your support. If you cannot control the Dornish, you must sever ties before they choke you." Robb dismissed the council before the shouting could grow worse. When Oberyn entered later that night, his expression was stormdark. "You think I did this?" the prince demanded. "I think Tywin wants me to believe you did," Robb said, "and he's succeeding." Oberyn paced, his spear in hand, the firelight throwing long shadows across the tent walls. "Those were not my men. But if I deny it, your lords will still spit on the ground when they hear my name. So perhaps I should make the lie truth and burn something worth the trouble." "This isn't a game," Robb snapped. "I'm losing the loyalty of men who fought for me since Winterfell. I can't hold this alliance together if my own house thinks I've sold them to you." Oberyn stopped pacing. "Then tell them the truth, that I am the only reason you've kept Tywin off balance, that without me, your war ends with your head on a spike." Robb stared at him, the space between them charged with something that was half fury, half respect. "I need time," Robb said finally. "Keep your men away from the Stormlands. No raids, no fires, nothing they can use against you. Give me that, and I'll keep the wolves from turning on the viper." Oberyn's gaze lingered a moment longer, then he gave a sharp nod. 7 days, no more. But 7 days was more than Tywin needed in Harrenhal. A raven, left under his seal, carried only one order to Seer Adam Marbrand: strike at the Dornish host north of the Reach, leave survivors. Let them run to their prince with tales of the young. Wolf's treachery. The lion was about to turn the snake against the wolf. It began with fire in the night. Oberyn's camp, hidden in a hollow north of the Reach, awoke to screams and the crackle of burning tents. Riders in wolf-marked cloaks swept through the darkness, cutting down sentries and slashing at anyone who tried to form ranks. The attack was brutal but brief, gone almost as quickly as it began, leaving the camp a ruin of smoke, blood, and confusion. By dawn, the survivors were telling the same story. The young wolf had turned on them. When the first battered Dornish riders stumbled into Robb's camp 2 days later, their wounds fresh and their tempers hotter than the desert sun, the accusations came fast. Oberyn himself dismounted in the snow, his face set like carved stone. You, his voice carried over the camp like a whip crack. You send your wolves in the night to butcher my men, and then you dare face me without shame. Robb felt the stares of his bannermen like knives in his back. I didn't order this, he said firmly. If my men were there, they were not sent by me. They wore your cloaks, Oberyn spat. They called your name before they cut down men I've ridden with since Sunspear. Tell me, Stark, is this your honor? Around them, Karstark and Glover muttered in satisfaction, while Edmure looked stricken. Bolton, ever still, simply watched, pale eyes unblinking. This is Tywin's work, Robb said, stepping closer. He wants us at each other's throats. If you can't see that, what I see, Oberyn interrupted, is that your control over your own bannermen is weaker than you think. And in war, a weak king is worse than an enemy. For a moment, Robb thought Oberyn might draw his spear. Grey wind stood between them, teeth bared, the low growl in his throat matching the tension in the air. Leave, Robb said at last, voice low but iron hard. Take your men and ride south. I'll send word when I've found the truth. Oberyn's lips curled in something between a smile and a snarl. You have until the snows fall thicker. Then this, after that. The viper strikes where it pleases. He mounted and rode out without looking back, his spearmen following. The sound of their hooves faded into the cold morning, leaving the Stark camp quieter than it had been in weeks. Robb turned to his war council. Find me the ones who wore our cloaks that night. I don't care if it takes every scout we have. Someone is going to pay for this. Bolton's voice broke the silence. If I may, Your Grace, perhaps the better question is not who wore our cloaks, but who put them there. Far to the south, in Harrenhal, Tywin received word of Oberyn's departure with a thin smile. The lion's paw had pried the viper from the wolf. Now it was only a matter of deciding which one to kill first. The snows came early. By the time Robb's scouts returned with the truth, the riverlands lay under a sheet of frost and the roads to Dorne were choked with ice and mud. The men who'd attacked Oberyn's camp were not Stark men at all. They were mercenaries in stolen cloaks, paid in gold, and sent by a name the survivors whispered only once. Marbrand. Robb slammed his fist against the map table hard enough to topple a candle. Tywin had played them perfectly, and every day Oberyn remained apart gave the lion more time to tighten his grip. Still, there was one chance. He sent 3 riders south with the proof, captured mercenaries who'd confessed under oath, and a message for Oberyn. Meet me where the green fork freezes. The lion will bleed, but only if the wolf and viper strike together. The answer came on the 6th day, just as the snow began to fall in thick, silent flakes. Oberyn rode into camp with half his original host, leaner but harder-eyed. The greeting was curt. No clasped hands, no warm words, only a mutual understanding that without each other the war was lost. Robb didn't waste time. He laid out his plan, a feigned retreat by the Stark host to draw Tywin into the Riverlands, while Oberyn's riders swept in from the south to cut his supply lines completely. Then both forces would converge on Harrenhal and trap the lion between them. Oberyn listened, then gave a short nod. One battle, one strike, then our debt is settled. The trap was sprung 2 weeks later. Stark forces fell back in apparent disarray, Bolton leading the rearguard with his usual cold precision. Tywin, scenting victory, drove his men hard to finish the young wolf before winter sealed the passes. That's when Oberyn's spearmen came screaming out of the southern mists, their lances cutting through supply wagons and scattering Tywin's rearguard. At the same moment, Robb's retreating army wheeled around, slamming into the Lions' front lines with grey wind at their head. The fighting lasted until nightfall. Steel clashed, horses screamed, and the muddy ground turned to red slush underfoot. In the end, Tywin's army broke, not shattered entirely, but forced into a desperate withdrawal toward the Westerlands, leaving Harrenhal to the wolf and the viper. When it was over, Robb and Oberyn stood side by side atop the ruined walls, watching the Lannister banners vanish into the dark. "You have your victory," Oberyn said, "and I have my proof that the lion bleeds." Robb looked at him, and after this, Oberyn's smile was thin. "After this, we return to our own wars. The wolf's road runs north, the viper's run south. If they cross again," he let the words hang in the cold air. They parted. At dawn, the alliance had been enough to turn the tide for now, but it was an alliance born of necessity, not trust, and in Westeros, necessity rarely lasted long. Far away, in the depths of the Westerlands, Tywin Lannister studied the reports of his defeat. He allowed himself one slow breath of irritation, then began writing new letters. The wolf and the viper had struck together once, and he would make sure they never did again. The war was far from over,